Well, hello, good evening, and welcome again to another one of our Lansdowne Church online Sunday guest interview programs. So who's our guest tonight? Well, let me introduce him briefly to you. In the 1950s, a young man, aged 16, went forward at a Billy Graham crusade in New York to commit his life to Christ. That young boy was George Verwer. He'd been prayed for by an elderly lady for many years before. And from that moment on, George committed his life not just to Christ, but to the spreading of the good news of Jesus across the world. Eventually, George was to become the first international director of Operation Mobilisation, a unique missionary enterprise, George being one of the most entrepreneurial, creative, and energetic Christian mission leaders of the 20th century. It all began, actually, in the back of a camper van, as George and a few friends took Christian literature into New Mexico. And then eventually they had a burden to reach India, but ended up actually serving Europe, literature into Spain and France. And so was born this movement that today has 5,000 workers across 113 nations. The work of Operation Mobilisation, literature distribution, mission teams, and of course, the port ministry through ships like MV Doulos and now most recently Logos Hope. George is a remarkable individual who at 82 still is firing on all cylinders. And I caught up with him a few weeks ago to ask him how he was doing during these COVID times and what he saw as the big issues facing the Christian church today in global missions. So let's sit back, enjoy this interview, and then hang around afterwards for a live Q&A. We'll be able to ask George all kinds of questions. And I tell you, George is still right on the money. So let's enjoy this together. Well, I'm joined by George Verwer, our great OM guy. And George, welcome to Lansdowne Church online program.
Good to be here.
We're delighted that you've found time to just chat to us and share with us something of your heart and passion for missions, of course. But you were last in Lansdowne, Bournemouth, I think several years ago when we had the old building. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah.
And you've got a grandson in Bournemouth, yeah?
Yeah, he's just been told to be no going to class. It's going to be all on the internet. So but he's in Bournemouth. He's in Bournemouth right now.
Yeah, he's in Bournemouth right now. George, you've been married, I think, 60 years.
Yeah.
You're a granddad, obviously. I know you're a great prayer warrior. We know you for your commitment to prayer, for the kingdom and for missions. But when it comes to your family, George, how do you kind of bring that reality to God? Your grandson, your other grandkids, your marriage. How do you pray about those things?
Well, fortunately, that evolved over 60 years. Didn't all hit me at once. And fortunately, also, my generation was getting teaching about how missionaries sometimes had difficulties in their families. Back then, some societies said the wife is a missionary first and a wife second. If they didn't say it, they practiced it. And we had the privilege of learning from their mistakes, not that we were better than them. And so generally, we made family a very vital part of everything, even those of us who were missionaries. And we gave our wives the choice. If they felt they wanted more ministry, even though they had children, we'd work it out. But if they felt just with children, my wife soon had 3 children. She's a professional secretary. She's always done something. If they wanted to mainly give themselves to family and children, we gave that choice. I think that really helped us. We also discouraged sending kids off to boarding school. So I sent my older son off we weren't practicing everything we preach. So we're just thankful for these great missionaries that went on ahead of us through their books and meeting them, especially going to Moody Bible Institute. We learned from their teaching and their exhortation. So family has always been a priority. All of my kids, though they don't all follow the Lord, they're all very gung-ho about their childhood. Of course, they love to always tell the negative stories, but we have good contact. We have 6 great-grandchildren now, and our oldest great-grandchild was 5 yesterday. Wow. So you're looking at a really old buzzard. I hope it's not too hard in your eyes.
Great granddaddy George. That's good. George, I mean, this is a significant year for you. I mean, you're 82, but I'm not talking about that. You've been married for 60 years. I'm not talking about that. But this is also, as far as I'm aware, the 60th anniversary of the mission into Europe.
Yeah.
So how are you celebrating that?
Yeah, almost this week. 60 years ago this week, we arrived. And again, here I was so extreme. I put my wife pregnant for our first son on an airplane on her own. And she's sort of a shy woman. Fly to Madrid. I wanted to go to Paris where I heard I could get an old vehicle cheap. And I wanted to check out France. So I came by ship, the old Queen Elizabeth. And of course, the vehicle blew up on the way to Madrid. I thought I'm never going to meet her. But somehow I got to the airport just as she landed. And that was 60 years ago. And I can tell you, though we've never returned to America except for brief visits, we've never had a day. We've never had a day when we weren't committed to what God was wanting to do. But fortunately, it's only one day at a time, because some days are really scary.
Yeah, sure. And 60 years in Europe, obviously that's part of the great global impact of OM mission. George, this year is significant in other ways as well for you. You lost a dear friend, Peter Maiden. And I know you've written about his death and his impact on your life and on OM. How would you sum that up, George? How would you assess Peter's influence on you and on the missions in the world?
No, it would be on a practical level, not from comparing with Billy Graham, my spiritual father, or Oswald Smith, people from outside, but from within the movement. Certainly the most important person, together with Dale Roton, who's very similar to Peter Maiden in temperament and in solidness. Where in the camp I don't put myself, and so you can't measure. 46 years he was always there. And I made him my associate at a time when I thought maybe I was going to come unglued. There were so many problems, and we were in tension about finance and, whether we asked for money and all these. I never realized how complicated. Eventually, I wrote a book about it, God's Work, and he was the British director, and then he took on that role, and then he became my successor, and really one of my closest friends. And so I greatly miss him, but he was battling cancer for a year. I visited, we were sort of prepared. Yeah. And it was quite a moment to be at his funeral. And I'm, of course, now pushing his books more than ever. And this is his book, Building on the Rock. His latest book is Radical Gratitude, which is just out. But this is an earlier book. I think this message actually is more needed. Both are needed, but this is so needed. Building on the Rock. And he shares his own struggle and his own failure in this area due to his background, which is the subject of my new book, Toxic Perfectionism. So we thank God for his life. His life, now that he's gone, it doesn't speak to us. No, it shouts. And I pray people will hear it, because he's an example of someone very, very English, from a very traditional English family in a very traditional English place. Have you ever heard of Cumbria?
Yeah.
And yet he embraced global missions and spent a huge part of his life, all over the world, to the sacrifice of his family. And more hard for him because he really didn't like travel, where I was wired for travel from like day one when I went from New York City to Mexico City in an old truck. So we really have a lot to celebrate in his legacy. I've got a lot of his sermons now on sermonindex.net. And probably on YouTube. So his message, his life will speak. Of course, he became the chairman of the Keswick Convention. I've always, even back in Chicago, was a great Keswick fan, because George Duncan, great Keswick speaker, came to Moody. And Alan Redpath, was preaching down the road at Moody Church. So when I got here, perhaps the most encouraging invite in my life is when I was very young to be invited to speak at the Keswick Convention. I really didn't fit in very well, but they were very loving and patient. Some of them still have their questions to this day.
I know that you and Peter were a great team, and he's greatly missed. But the gospel, the mission of the church goes on. George, this is obviously a world in which we're all trying to manage missions in a COVID-19 pandemic. Can we just touch on some of the big stories coming out of parts of the world? I'm thinking particularly of India. I know India's on your heart, like many countries in the world, but India's big for you. Well, have you got any latest update on what's happening with mission in India as far as OM are concerned?
Yeah, I mean, our work in India through a painful time spun out. I was not a leader of OM. I chose total closure, including advisory. But when the India crisis hit, I sort of got in. In fact, Peter Maiden said, look, your pastoral encouragement might be an encouragement to them at this time, because they were coming down harder than me. Some mistakes made, not serious stuff, but mistakes were made in handling finance. Because Joseph, probably our most outstanding leader in our history, just took India to a whole new level. Soon there were 2,000 churches, 100 schools. He pioneered humanitarian work within OM with several others. But the handling of money and finding people who didn't have their hand in the till, all of this was a nightmare. Anyway, it came out and became an indigenous church movement. It's really more in line with Anglican churches because of the strong influence of the Anglican missionaries in India, which is still there. And so in the culture, especially in the government, if you're not a bishop, they really don't want to talk to you. So, we now, to my surprise, we have bishops. But God prepared me for that, because I never expected to live in Great Britain. And I've been here 55 years whenever I've not been traveling. So we embrace the changes, but we have people really upset with it all. And they're now upset with me. So that's life.
So how's as far as you know it, George, how is the mission of OM impacting on the ground in terms of COVID-19? What are some of the big projects that you may be aware of?
Yeah, because it's an indigenous movement and people live on a wholly different level of income than we can even think about. We were able to convert some of our churches into feeding stations. We were able to. We have clinics already. We were already wired. The clinics are overloaded. Our head person has COVID-19. They have a much lower death rate there. They're researching that, why so many get this and so few die. Maybe it's that they have more general immunity. Even the slum dwellers. We can't imagine the level and the amount of slums in India. Probably 20%. Don't quote me. It may be higher. Huge percentage of all the people who live in slums and then live outside of slum. So when this hit, it is an earthquake for the nation, which was already in difficulty because this present government is very, very more Hindu, and Muslims are being persecuted, Christians are being persecuted, not to a huge level yet, but it's quite scary. And the enemy is trying to use this to grip people with a spirit of fear. Meanwhile, tens of thousands are turning to Jesus. And OM is just one of the players that has a lot of churches. And that is very difficult during lockdown. Many of them don't do Zoom. They're poor people and they're in rural areas. And so they haven't been gathering in their churches. That's a big prayer request of how we continue to handle this, not just OM, but all the many. It's a huge nation, 120 million. But God is working in the midst of it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Helpful perspectives, those George. And I know that I think at the last count, there are over 5,000 OM workers in 100 nations. And you've got 465 Brits. Is that right?
That's right. And we've got a great British leader, Matthew Skirton, who's actually a South Coast person.
Yeah.
And I think that he is really the most outstanding we've had as far as communication since Peter Maiden. Our other leaders since then have been great leaders, team players. I highly honor them, but then all have that ability to, stand up in front of a British audience and get through to their heart. And Matthew has that. And of course, he's also one of the first leaders to have so many years. Gary Sloan had quite a few, our previous guy, tremendous brother. But Matthew had a lot of years out in the mission field in Moldova. He's not one of his children just wrote asking for money today because she's joining OM's gap year. OM has a lot of people come in their gap year.
Yes.
So he's got a large family.
Yeah.
So we're excited. We're excited about the present time. We're not that interested in dwelling on the past. We want to make it happen now.
Yeah, and of course the ship is still going. I guess it's in dock right now, but I mean the ship ministry.
No, it's sailing. It's sailing.
It's sailing, is it?
Yeah, first time in a long time. It's headed for an island in the Bahamas to work with YWAM in a humanitarian crisis due to a storm. Our normal ministry is closed down, which is a huge challenge. Believe me, the whole mass evangelism, book exhibits, conferences. What is the future? But we have these different hats. So the humanitarian hat is on, and the gospel, of course, will get shared. Yeah. I mean, we're in countries where people easily come to Christ. Becoming radical disciples, that's a little further down the road. But as a pastor, you know a little about that.
Yeah. Hey, George, how do you read the state of missions interest in the church in the UK? We're hearing lots of good things that's happening across the world. You referenced there people coming to faith through OM ministries, but you're a kind of adopted Brit. You know the British church scene. How do you read the state of the heart of the church in the UK for missions?
First of all, I love Britain. I'm not planning to return home. I could give you a memo, 25 reasons why I love Britain. And I love the church. I preached in over 1,000 churches. But we have to face the impact of our culture. And I've been restudying British history. The impact of the culture on the church is huge, huge. And tracing it right back to Henry VIII and before Henry VIII and how we embraced the Christian nation with all the positives and negatives of that. That day is changing now. That day is changing. And we have to, rather than keep complaining and moaning and, this legislation and that legislation, we need to see what God is doing and get God's mind. And it should be global. 95% of everything British people do, 95% money, manpower. We got a lot of gifted people in this country, especially the Anglicans. You guys got a few as well. But it's all for Britain. It's all for Britain. Only 5%. And I believe it's at a very low ebb right now because of many, many factors and just survival, viruses. Am I going to die next month? And then people losing their jobs. It's so much easier to help a brother next door who needs a little money than send money to some dying person in Calcutta. And so, and when you think of all the money put into these academies and study the history of that one to get your circuits blown, it's all for Britain. We got to save the nation. The nation's in trouble. We got to save the nation. I don't find that in the New Testament. I don't find it. I find aspects, salt and light, influence as much as we can. Don't think I'm negative about all these things. But we need spokespeople for the rest of the world. If 95% are over here, Peter Maiden was one of those. You don't necessarily have to go there. You have been one, or you wouldn't have this dangerous speaker interviewing him for your church. And your church, going right back to the early days, was one of the most proactive in inviting me. And I'm still in touch with Harry Kilbride, who's moved to Poole.
Just down the road. Yeah, he's down the road. Yeah. So, George, finally, we talk a lot at the moment.
I don't like the finally stuff.
There has to be a finally at some point.
Yeah, no, finally for preacher 10 minutes later.
Yeah, that's right. So finally, George, in terms of the response of believers and churches to the pandemic, the word resilience is used quite a bit nowadays. In terms of what's going to get us through this crazy world in which we're living is resilience. Would you agree with that, or would you find another word?
No, that's part of the picture, but it's not the whole part. We always need vision. We need action. We need to be proactive. To me, proactive is better than the word resilience, but I take it all in. And we need to be, this has been one of the most exciting periods of my entire life, the last 6 months, because it opened doors to talk to thousands through Zoom all over the world. It opened doors to a whole new Facebook ministry. My last Facebook thing, I think, had 40,000 people at least taking a glance. And more than that, in my situation, it's given me precious time to live with my wife. I actually know how to make salads now. I do the shopping. I bring her tea and toast every morning. This has been a major transformation, and it was well overdue in my life. So people need to be proactive. They need to be positive. almost every day I sing because I've got a negative streak. I can feel really discouraged, especially over global suffering and the behavior of God's chosen frozen. And I just somehow repent and embrace Jesus. And I often sing, count your many blessings, name them one by one. And the word of God says, with food and clothing, be content. And we live in a nation where not many are lacking food and clothing. We know we know about food banks. We've heard all the stories. People go to food banks who've already got, plenty of cigarettes and food and alcohol back in their house, but they go to the food bank. Others, of course, are totally legitimate. Hallelujah.
George, you're a great blessing to us all. And it's so good to see your passion and hear your passion after all these years. We're going to be following this program with a Q&A where folks from Lansdowne can ask you questions. But for now, George, thank you so much. We're going to carry as well the information about how folks can find out about OM and your book ministry and all the book plugs that you've done. But we'll pick up some of the questions in the session that follows. All right? And we look forward very much to you engaging with us in that way. But for now, George, thank you so much and God bless you.
God bless you. Thank you. It's a great privilege. Unworthy servant.